pouring rain washed the grey streets of Manhattan, hiding the tears of those who had lost everything. Ethan stood in the sprawling cemetery, a man holding immense wealth, but entirely bankrupt in his soul. For 20 years he had lived with a ghost, anchored to a tragic mistake that destroyed his only chance at true happiness. But fate has a strange way of returning what was stolen. A shivering, pregnant homeless girl was about to shatter his cold reality, dragging him back into a nightmare of lies he thought was buried forever. This is a story about the unbreakable ties of blood and the ultimate price of absolute control. Ethan was a highly successful architect, designing skyscrapers that touched the clouds, while his own life remained trapped in darkness. 2 decades ago, he had fallen madly in love with Chloe, a beautiful girl from a forgotten Ohio town who came to New York chasing a dream. Instead of a dream, she found a golden cage, trapped in a loveless marriage with a ruthless Wall Street titan named Richard. For a brief shining moment, Chloe and Ethan found each other, risking everything to escape into the anonymity of Brooklyn. But Richard was not a man who let his possessions go. He wielded his power like a weapon, forcing Chloe into a desperate corner. She vanished from Ethan's life, leaving only a cold, heartbreaking phone call before dying in a tragic car crash a year later. Ethan survived, building an empire on his grief, unaware that the darkest secrets of Richard's manipulation were still waiting to be unearthed. The relentless rain battered the cold marble stones of Greenwood Cemetery. Ethan stood beneath a massive black umbrella, listening to the heavy drops drumming against the tight fabric. The grey Manhattan skyline loomed in the distance, a jagged silhouette against the weeping sky. It had been exactly 20 years, but the hollow ache in his chest remained as raw as a fresh wound. He adjusted the collar of his tailored charcoal coat, the damp autumn wind cutting through the expensive wool. Today was the anniversary of Chloe's death. The world had moved on, but Ethan was still trapped in the memory of that icy morgue upstate. As he turned down the familiar gravel path to leave, his peripheral vision caught a sudden movement. A young girl, barely out of her teens, was huddled beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. She was shivering violently, her thin, oversized denim jacket completely soaked. But it was her swollen belly that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. She was heavily pregnant, utterly alone in a city that chewed up the vulnerable and spat them out without a second thought. Her eyes, wide and terrified like a cornered doe, locked onto his. Ethan felt a sudden, inexplicable tightening in his chest. He reached into his leather wallet, his fingers brushing against crisp banknotes. He stepped off the path, his expensive shoes sinking into the muddy grass, and approached her slowly, as if trying to tame a wild bird. He extended $100 bill. The girl hesitated, her pale, trembling fingers finally snatching the money before she turned and vanished into the thick fog. Ethan stood completely still, haunted by the ghost of a familiar gaze. The towering glass windows of his Manhattan office offered a panoramic view of the bustling city below, but Ethan saw none of it. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, the rhythmic tapping of his expensive pen the only sound in the cavernous room. The encounter at the cemetery replayed in his mind like a broken film reel. There was something about the way that homeless girl looked at him. It was a look of profound, desperate sorrow that mirrored the darkest corners of his own soul. His secretary, Jessica, quietly opened the heavy oak door. She was a woman of impeccable grace, her presence always bringing a subtle calm to the chaotic corporate environment. She placed a steaming cup of black coffee on his desk, her sharp eyes studying his tired face. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples, in a futile attempt to erase the rising headache. He had everything a man could possibly desire. He had millions in the bank, luxury cars, and a penthouse overlooking Central Park, yet the sprawling emptiness of his life was suffocating. Jessica asked softly if he needed anything else, her voice laced with genuine concern. He shook his head, offering a weak, unconvincing smile. As the door clicked shut behind her, Ethan leaned back in his leather chair and closed his eyes. The scent of the rain seemed to cling to his suit, pulling him back 2 decades into the past. He remembered the smell of cheap vanilla perfume, the neon lights of a seedy downtown club, and the nervous, beautiful smile of a girl who had no idea how cruel the world could truly be. The memories flooded in, violently tearing down the mental walls he had spent years carefully building. Chloe woke up to the sound of absolute terrifying silence. The silk sheets of the Upper East Side penthouse felt like ice against her bare skin. She slowly opened her bright green eyes, the morning sunlight filtering harshly through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beside her, the king-size bed was empty. Richard had already left for Wall Street, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive cologne and cigar smoke. Chloe let out a long, shaky breath, grateful for the temporary reprieve. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress, her toes sinking into the plush white carpet. She walked toward the master bathroom, avoiding her reflection in the mirrored hallway. Inside the marble-clad sanctuary, she finally looked at herself. She was undeniably beautiful, her long chestnut hair framing a face that belonged on the cover of a magazine, but her eyes told a different story. They were vacant, exhausted, carrying the weight of a prisoner serving a life sentence. She gently touched the left side of her face. Beneath a thick layer of expensive foundation, a dark, purplish bruise was still fading. It was a silent testament to Richard's terrifying temper. He demanded perfection, and any perceived flaw or act of defiance was met with swift, brutal correction. She opened the gold-plated faucet, splashing freezing water onto her face. She had traded the grinding poverty of her childhood for a life of unimaginable luxury, but the price she paid was her own soul. Chloe began her meticulous morning routine. She had to look flawless. Richard was hosting a charity gala that evening, and she needed to play the role of the perfect, adoring billionaire's wife. Every stroke of the makeup brush felt like painting a mask on a corpse. The sudden, jarring ring of her cell phone shattered the quiet elegance of the penthouse. Chloe jumped, her heart skipping a beat before she saw the caller ID. It was Sarah. A genuine smile, the first of the day, touched her lips as she answered. Sarah's voice exploded through the speaker, loud, chaotic, and brimming with reckless energy. Sirens wailed in the background, mixed with the aggressive honking of New York taxicabs. Sarah was Chloe's oldest friend, the wild hurricane who had convinced her to leave Ohio 5 years ago. While Chloe was trapped in a sterile ivory tower, Sarah lived in the gritty, pulsating heart of Brooklyn, bouncing between bartender jobs and disastrous romantic flings. Sarah demanded to know Chloe's plans for the day, barely pausing for a breath. Chloe laughed softly, the sound feeling foreign in her own throat. She listed her schedule of massages, manicures, and endless personal grooming, masking the profound emptiness of it all. Sarah scoffed, loudly complaining about her own chaotic life, unpaid shifts, and a string of bad dates. But beneath the complaining, Sarah possessed a fierce, unfiltered freedom that Chloe secretly envied. Sarah announced she was coming over to the city later, bringing her older brother Ethan, who was visiting from out of town. The mention of Ethan's name sent an unexpected jolt of electricity straight down Chloe's spine. Ethan. She hadn't seen him in years. He used to be the kind, older teenager she secretly harboured a massive crush on back in high school. Panic and excitement warred in her chest. She quickly agreed to meet them, hanging up the phone with trembling fingers. The perfectly ordered world Richard demanded was about to collide with her messy, forgotten past. The memories of their desperate escape from Ohio washed over Chloe as she sat alone in the massive dining room. They had been so young, so incredibly naive. Chloe grew up wearing second-hand clothes, her single mother working 3 jobs just to keep the electricity running. Sarah, despite having a wealthier family, craved rebellion and chaos. The moment they graduated, Sarah bought 2 one-way bus tickets to the Port Authority terminal. They arrived in Manhattan with nothing but cheap suitcases and oversized dreams. The city did not welcome them with open arms. They bounced between filthy hostels, eating dollar slices of pizza, and quickly learning that the streets were paved with predators, not gold. Finding decent work was impossible for 2 uneducated girls from the Midwest. Eventually, Sarah dragged them into the neon-lit underbelly of the city's elite nightclub scene. It was a place where rich men bought the illusion of youth and affection. Sarah thrived in the chaotic energy, effortlessly manipulating wealthy patrons for massive tips. But Chloe was terrified. She shrank away from the wandering hands and predatory gazes, choosing to hide in the back, carrying trays and wiping down sticky tables. She refused to sell her dignity even when her bank account was completely empty. It was in that dark, booming club that Richard first noticed her. He was older, powerful, and commanded the room without raising his voice. He watched her quietly from a VIP booth, his cold, calculating eyes tracking her every move. He saw a beautiful, frightened bird, and he decided right then and there that he was going to buy a golden cage to put her in. Richard did not court her like a normal man. He orchestrated a hostile takeover of her life. He started leaving $100 bills on her empty trays. Then came the extravagant bouquets of red roses delivered to her terrible apartment. Finally, he demanded her company for a single dinner. Chloe, exhausted by poverty and intimidated by his power, reluctantly agreed. He sent a black town car with a private driver to collect her. The restaurant was perched high above the city, a place where a single bottle of wine cost more than her mother made in a month. Richard was charming, articulate, and completely overwhelming. He listened to her fears, promised to protect her, and painted a picture of a life where she would never have to worry about money again. It felt like a modern fairy tale. She was utterly swept off her feet, mistaking his absolute control for intense devotion. Within a year, they were married in a lavish ceremony featured in high society magazines. But the fairy tale violently unravelled the moment the wedding ring slipped onto her finger. The charming protector morphed into a paranoid, jealous dictator. He dictated what she wore, who she spoke to, and where she went. She was forbidden from working. She was heavily discouraged from seeing her old friends. He provided her with a private driver who doubled as a bodyguard and an informant. The first time he struck her was over a perceived slight at a dinner party. He apologised with a diamond necklace the next day. The diamonds were heavy, sparkling, and cold. By the time she fully realised she was a prisoner, the walls of the penthouse were too thick to break through. She had sold her freedom for safety, only to discover she was living with a monster. That evening, Chloe nervously stood outside Sarah's run-down apartment building in Brooklyn. The contrast to her own life was staggering. The streets smelled of roasted nuts and damp garbage, the sidewalks packed with rushing commuters. She smoothed down her designer coat, feeling entirely out of place. She pressed the rusty buzzer, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The heavy metal door buzzed open, and she climbed the narrow, dimly lit stairs. When the apartment door swung open, the breath was instantly knocked out of her lungs. It wasn't Sarah standing there. It was Ethan. He was taller, his shoulders broader, his face matured into striking, rugged, handsome lines. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and for a terrifying second, the rest of the world simply ceased to exist. He smiled, that same warm, genuine smile that used to make her teenage heart flutter. He didn't look at her expensive clothes or the massive diamond on her finger. He just looked at her. They stepped into the small, chaotic living room. Sarah was running around in a panic trying to find her keys. The awkwardness dissolved almost instantly. Ethan poured them cheap red wine into mismatched glasses, his deep voice filling the small space with comfort and warmth. They sat on a battered thrift store sofa, talking about the past, laughing at old memories. For the first time in years, Chloe felt the invisible crushing weight lift from her chest. She wasn't Richard's trophy wife here. She was just Chloe. Every time Ethan's eyes met hers, she felt a dangerous, undeniable spark ignite. It was a spark that threatened to burn down her entire carefully constructed life. As the evening wore on, Sarah aggressively poured more wine, her laughter growing louder and more chaotic. She insisted Chloe show Ethan the photos from her luxurious European honeymoon. Chloe hesitated, a deep flush creeping up her neck. She reluctantly pulled out her phone, scrolling through the perfectly curated images. There was Chloe on a yacht in Monaco, Chloe dining in front of the Eiffel Tower, Chloe skiing in Aspen. In every single picture, she was dressed flawlessly, draped in designer brands, standing next to a stern, unsmiling Richard. Sarah gasped at the sheer display of wealth, oblivious to the truth. But Ethan was not looking at the expensive backgrounds or the shiny jewellery. He was staring intensely at Chloe's face in the photos. He saw the forced, brittle smile. He noticed the absolute lack of light in her beautiful green eyes. He saw the rigid posture of a woman terrified of making a wrong move. He didn't say a word, but his silence was deafening. He leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against hers. The physical contact sent a shockwave of heat straight through her veins. Chloe hastily locked her phone, the shame suddenly too much to bear. She felt exposed. Ethan knew. He could see right through the facade of the billionaire's wife. He saw the battered, exhausted girl trapped inside the designer shell. Sarah, completely oblivious to the intense, silent conversation happening beside her, finally passed out on the armchair, exhausted from her own chaotic lifestyle. The small apartment suddenly felt incredibly intimate. The air grew thick, charged with unspoken words and dangerous possibilities. Chloe knew she should leave, call her driver and return to her cage, but her legs absolutely refused to move. Ethan quietly stood up and walked toward the small kitchenette to grab a glass of water. Chloe followed him, her high heels clicking softly against the worn linoleum floor. The kitchen was tiny, the fluorescent light buzzing gently overhead. She stood beside the counter, her hands nervously tracing the edge of the cheap laminate. Ethan turned around, standing so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He looked down at her, his blue eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. He slowly reached out, his rough, warm fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. He avoided the area where her heavy makeup concealed the fading bruise, as if he instinctively knew where she was broken. Chloe trembled, her breath catching in her throat. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. It was the first gentle, loving contact she had experienced in years. Ethan whispered her name, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't ask about Richard. He didn't ask about the money. He just leaned down and pressed his lips against hers. The kiss started soft, hesitant, but quickly ignited into a desperate, consuming fire. Chloe threw her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, pouring years of suppressed agony, loneliness, and suppressed desire into that single kiss. A wine glass was knocked off the counter, shattering loudly against the floor. But neither of them cared. In that tiny, run-down Brooklyn kitchen, Chloe finally found the courage she thought she had lost forever. She pulled back, gasping for air, her forehead resting against his chest. She knew with absolute certainty that she could never go back to her old life. The cage was broken. The euphoria of the kiss shattered the moment Chloe stepped out of the private elevator and into the penthouse. The massive living room was bathed in cold, unnatural light. Richard was sitting in his leather armchair, a glass of expensive scotch resting in his hand. The silence was heavier than a physical blow. He slowly stood up, his eyes locking onto her dishevelled appearance. He didn't yell. He never yelled. His voice was dangerously calm, a quiet poison that paralyzed her. He demanded to know exactly where she had been. He knew her driver had dropped her off in Brooklyn, a neighborhood he considered a filthy slum. Chloe tried to lie, her voice trembling, claiming she simply lost track of time talking with Sarah. Richard closed the distance between them with terrifying speed. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like iron claws. He leaned in, his breath reeking of alcohol, and whispered that she belonged to him. Every piece of clothing, every breath she took, was funded by his money. He violently shoved her away. Chloe stumbled, her hip crashing against the sharp edge of the marble coffee table. Pain flared hot and bright, but she bit her lip, refusing to cry out. Richard straightened his expensive cuffs, looking down at her with absolute disgust. He informed her that she was restricted to the penthouse until she learned how to be a proper wife again. He turned and walked into his study, locking the heavy mahogany door. Chloe remained on the floor, trembling in the cold silence. The fear that usually paralyzed her was suddenly gone, replaced by a burning, desperate clarity. If she stayed in this apartment, Richard was going to kill her. The digital clock on the bedside table read 3 a.m. The penthouse was deathly quiet. Chloe moved through the dark rooms like a shadow, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of absolute terror and desperate hope. She grabbed a small, unassuming duffel bag from the closet. She didn't pack the silk dresses, the designer bags, or the expensive perfumes. She packed plain jeans, a couple of warm sweaters, and a worn-out pair of sneakers she had hidden away. She walked into the master bathroom, standing before the massive mirror one last time. She slowly twisted the heavy platinum wedding ring off her finger. It resisted, digging into her skin, but she yanked it free. She walked to the marble island in the kitchen and placed the ring exactly in the centre, resting it gently on a hastily scribbled note that read, "I am done." She crept toward the service elevator, praying the security guard at the front desk was asleep. She bypassed the main lobby, slipping out through the loading dock. When the heavy metal door clicked shut behind her, the freezing night air hit her face. It felt like the breath of God. She ran. She ran through the empty streets of Manhattan, ignoring the pain in her hip and the burning in her lungs. She ducked into the nearest subway station, using the last few crumpled dollar bills in her pocket to buy a ticket. As the train roared through the dark tunnels toward Brooklyn, Chloe wrapped her arms around herself, shivering uncontrollably. She was penniless, terrified, and hunted by one of the most powerful men in the city. But as the train crossed the bridge, she looked at the dark water below and smiled. She was finally free. Ethan's apartment became her entire world. The cramped space, with its peeling paint and rattling radiator, felt like a sacred sanctuary compared to the sterile luxury of the penthouse. For the first 2 months, they lived in a state of paranoid bliss. Ethan went to his entry-level architectural job during the day, while Chloe stayed hidden behind locked doors, jumping at every creak in the floorboards. But in the evenings, when Ethan returned, the fear vanished. They cooked cheap pasta, drank inexpensive beer, and talked for hours into the night. Ethan treated her like an equal, listening to her opinions, holding her when the nightmares of Richard's violence woke her in a cold sweat. They filed the divorce papers remotely, a terrifying gamble that surprisingly went unchallenged by Richard's massive legal team. The silence from the Upper East Side was unnatural, a heavy calm before a catastrophic storm. But Chloe wanted to believe the nightmare was over. She started looking for simple jobs, wanting to contribute, wanting to build a real life from scratch. She bought cheap pregnancy tests from the corner pharmacy, her hands shaking as she waited for the results. When the 2 pink lines appeared, she collapsed onto the bathroom floor, sobbing with overwhelming joy. It was Ethan's baby. They were going to start a real family, far away from the toxic poison of her past. She planned to tell him that very evening, preparing a special dinner, wearing a simple cotton dress he loved. She hummed a quiet tune as she chopped vegetables, the late afternoon sun spilling golden light across the tiny kitchen. She felt completely, utterly safe. It was the greatest illusion of her life. Ethan ran up the narrow stairs of his apartment building, clutching a small bouquet of grocery store daisies. He was exhausted, but excited to see Chloe's face. He unlocked the door, calling her name, but was met with complete, heavy silence. The apartment was dark. The kitchen counter was covered in half-chopped vegetables, an abandoned knife resting ominously on the cutting board. Panic gripped his throat like a vice. He dropped the flowers and rushed through the small rooms. Her duffel bag was gone. Her toothbrush was missing from the bathroom cup. He grabbed his cell phone, his hands shaking violently, and dialed her number. It rang endlessly, each tone amplifying his rising terror. Just as he was about to run to the police station, his phone vibrated in his hand. It was Chloe. He answered frantically, his voice cracking as he asked where she was. The voice on the other end was cold, flat, and entirely unrecognizable. Chloe spoke slowly, every word sounding carefully rehearsed. She told him that she couldn't do it anymore. She said that living in poverty was destroying her, that she missed the luxury, the cars, and the security. She claimed the entire affair was a mistake, a stupid rebellion, and she was returning to Richard, where she truly belonged. Ethan stood frozen, the phone pressed hard against his ear. He begged her to stop, to tell him what was really happening. He knew her. He knew this was a lie. But Chloe simply told him to never look for her again. The line went dead. The silence in the apartment was deafening. The illusion of their perfect life shattered into a million jagged pieces, cutting him to the absolute core. Ethan refused to believe the lies. He knew Richard had somehow gotten to her. Madness and desperation consumed him. He rented a cheap car and drove aggressively through the night toward Richard's sprawling, fortress-like estate in the Hamptons. The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the winding coastal roads. He arrived at the massive iron gates, screaming Chloe's name into the storm, banging his fist against the cold metal bars until his knuckles bled. The security cameras tracked his frantic movements. Minutes later, the heavy gates slowly swung open. But it wasn't Chloe walking down the long, manicured driveway. It was 3 massive security guards, dressed in black raincoats, their faces obscured by the darkness. Ethan didn't care. He charged forward, demanding to see his wife. The first punch caught him completely off guard, a brutal strike to his jaw that sent him crashing to the wet gravel. He tried to fight back, fueled by raw adrenaline and heartbreak, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. They beat him systematically, professionally. A heavy boot slammed into his ribs, cracking bone. Another blow struck his temple, causing the world to spin wildly out of control. Through the hazy, agonizing pain, he saw a black umbrella approaching. Richard stood over him, perfectly dry, his face a mask of absolute terrifying calm. Richard didn't say a single word. He simply looked at Ethan's broken body with total disdain, turned around, and walked back toward the glowing mansion. The guards delivered one final devastating kick to Ethan's head. The rain turned warm, mixing with his own blood, as the darkness finally pulled him under. Ethan woke up to the steady, irritating beep of a heart monitor. The blinding white lights of the hospital room pierced his retinas, causing a sharp, agonizing spike of pain in his skull. His entire body felt like shattered glass. He slowly turned his head, his vision swimming in and out of focus. Sitting in the sterile plastic chair next to his bed was Chloe. Her face was pale, stripped of all emotion, her green eyes empty and hollow. She wore an expensive designer coat, diamonds glittering coldly on her ears. Ethan tried to speak, his voice a broken, agonizing rasp. He reached out his bruised hand, pleading with her. Chloe stood up slowly, her posture rigid. She didn't reach back. She looked down at him, her expression a perfect mask of indifference. She told him, in a voice devoid of any warmth, that he was pathetic. She said his foolish attempt to play the hero had only embarrassed her. She explicitly stated that she chose Richard's wealth over his pathetic struggle, and that she never wanted to see him again. Ethan stared at her, his heart shattering completely. He searched her eyes for any sign of coercion, any hidden message, but she gave him absolutely nothing. She turned on her expensive heels and walked out the door, the sharp clicking echoing down the hallway like the ticking of a bomb. As the door swung shut, Ethan closed his eyes, a single tear escaping down his battered cheek. The pain in his body was nothing compared to the agony in his chest. He didn't know that just outside the door, Chloe had collapsed against the wall, sobbing silently, flanked by 2 of Richard's massive enforcers. She had successfully delivered the lie that saved Ethan's life. 1 year passed, a year of absolute darkness. Ethan threw himself entirely into his architectural work, using the crushing grief as fuel to build a corporate empire. He became cold, calculating, and incredibly wealthy, ironically transforming into a version of the men he despised. Then came the phone call that destroyed whatever fragments of his heart remained. It was a bleak Tuesday morning when the New York State Police contacted him. Because Richard and Chloe's divorce was never officially reversed in the system, Ethan was still listed as an emergency contact. The officer's voice was monotonous, a routine delivery of catastrophic news. There had been a terrible accident on a slick, winding mountain road in upstate New York. A black SUV had been run off the road, plummeting down a steep embankment. The vehicle burst into flames upon impact. The driver, Chloe, was killed instantly. The police suspected foul play. Another car had intentionally clipped her bumper, but there were no witnesses and no cameras on that desolate stretch of highway. Ethan dropped the phone, the plastic shattering against the hardwood floor of his office. He couldn't breathe. The walls of the room closed in on him. He flew upstate, fighting through the bureaucratic nightmare to see the body, but the fire had left almost nothing behind. It was a closed casket. Richard's lawyers swooped in like vultures, shutting Ethan out of the process, ensuring the investigation was quickly and quietly buried. Ethan stood alone at the back of the small cemetery during the burial, watching the rain wash away the fresh dirt. Chloe was gone forever. The only woman he had ever truly loved was dead, and he believed she had died hating him. Present day. The heavy iron gates of the elite psychiatric facility in upstate New York slid open, allowing Ethan's black SUV to enter the meticulously manicured grounds. The rain from the cemetery earlier that morning had stopped, leaving a heavy, oppressive humidity in the air. Ethan walked through the sterile, painfully bright corridors, his expensive shoes making no sound on the polished floors. He was here to see Sarah. After Chloe's death, Sarah had completely unraveled. The guilt of dragging Chloe to the city, combined with her own destructive lifestyle, had shattered her fragile mind. Ethan had spent a fortune keeping her in the best private facilities, desperately trying to save his sister. The head doctor, a man with a tired face and a pristine white coat, met Ethan outside her room. He shook his head grimly, explaining that Sarah was refusing food again, prone to violent outbursts and paranoid delusions. Ethan thanked the doctor tightly and pushed open the heavy wooden door. Sarah was sitting in a chair by the barred window, staring blankly at the grey sky. She looked terrifyingly thin, her chaotic energy replaced by a hollow, haunting stillness. Ethan pulled up a chair and sat beside her, speaking her name softly. She didn't move. He talked about the weather, about his boring corporate meetings, desperately trying to anchor her to reality. He had lost Chloe. He absolutely refused to lose his sister too. He reached out and gently covered her trembling, skeletal hand with his own. He was a billionaire who could build skyscrapers, but he felt entirely powerless to fix the broken minds of the people he loved. Suddenly, Sarah snatched her hand away, her eyes snapping toward Ethan with terrifying ferocity. The vacant stare was gone, replaced by a burning, manic rage. She stood up, knocking the chair backward with a loud clatter. She began pacing the small room, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. She accused Ethan of becoming a monster, a corporate tyrant who thought money could fix every tragedy. She screamed that he was just like Richard now, building golden cages to lock away the things he couldn't control. Ethan stood up, holding his hands out defensively, trying to calm her down. But Sarah was relentless. She screamed that Chloe's blood was on his hands, that if he had truly loved her, he would have fought harder, dug deeper, and saved her from Richard's clutches. Every word was a razor slicing into his deeply buried guilt. She laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that chilled Ethan to the bone, mocking his expensive suits and his sterile, perfectly controlled life. She yelled that he had spent 20 years mourning a ghost while ignoring the reality of the world around him. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew it was the sickness speaking, the trauma warping her perception. But the accusations hit too close to home. The nurses rushed into the room, syringes ready, grabbing Sarah's arms to subdue her. She fought wildly, screaming that she hated him. Ethan stepped back, his chest heaving, watching helplessly as they sedated his sister. As he walked out of the facility, the cold realization settled over him. Sarah was right. He had survived, but he had stopped living the day Chloe died. A week later, the corporate chaos of his architectural firm demanded his attention, but Ethan couldn't shake the restless anxiety gnawing at his stomach. He abruptly cancelled his afternoon meetings, ignoring the confused stares of his board members, and told his driver to take him back to Greenwood Cemetery. He needed the quiet. He needed to talk to the stone. As he approached Chloe's grave, the autumn sun finally broke through the grey clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured grass. Ethan stopped dead in his tracks. At the base of Chloe's headstone, resting against the cold grey marble, was a fresh bouquet of vibrant, cheap wildflowers. They were tied together with a frayed piece of blue ribbon. Ethan stared at the flowers, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nobody visited this grave. Chloe's parents had passed away long ago, and Sarah was locked in the facility. Richard, the controlling monster, would never lower himself to buy cheap field flowers. He would have sent a sterile arrangement of 50 dozen roses if he cared at all. Someone else had been here, someone recent. Ethan slowly knelt down, picking up the bouquet. The stems were still slightly damp. He looked around the vast silent cemetery, searching for a shadow, a retreating figure, anything. But he was entirely alone. A strange, suffocating paranoia gripped him. Who remembered Chloe? Who cared enough to bring these specific flowers? He gently placed the bouquet back against the stone, whispering an apology to his dead wife. He promised he would return soon, standing up and rushing back to his waiting car, his mind racing with impossible theories. The mystery of the flowers haunted Ethan's sleep. 3 days later, he returned to the cemetery, arriving just as the heavy iron gates opened at dawn. The morning mist clung to the ground like a thick, white blanket. He walked briskly down the gravel path, the cold air burning his lungs. As he rounded the corner toward Chloe's grave, he froze. A figure was kneeling in the dirt, their back turned to him. It was the girl, the pregnant, homeless teenager he had given the $100 bill to the week before. She was wearing the same oversized, soaked denim jacket, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She was speaking softly to the headstone, her voice carried away by the morning wind. Ethan's mind short-circuited. What was this girl doing here? He stepped forward, a twig snapping loudly beneath his expensive shoe. The girl flinched violently, spinning around with a look of absolute terror. She scrambled backward, trying to stand up, her hands protectively clutching her swollen belly. Ethan quickly raised his hands, his voice soft and desperate, begging her not to be afraid. He promised he wouldn't hurt her. He took a slow, deliberate step closer. The morning light hit her face, and Ethan felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. He couldn't breathe. The shape of her jaw, the specific shade of her striking green eyes, the slight curve of her nose. It wasn't an exact replica, but the resemblance was a brutal, undeniable punch to the gut. She looked exactly like Chloe did when she first arrived in New York. Ethan's voice trembled as he asked her, "Who are you visiting?" The girl wiped a tear from her dirty cheek and whispered, "I think she's my mother." The word mother echoed in the silent cemetery, deafening in its implications. Ethan stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of a nearby headstone to keep from collapsing. The entire foundation of his reality began to violently fracture. He stared at the terrified girl, trying to process the impossible information. How could Chloe have a daughter? She died 20 years ago. The math slammed into his brain like a freight train. 20 years. The girl in front of him looked exactly 19, maybe 20. Ethan took a frantic step forward, desperate to ask 1,000 questions, to demand the truth. But before he could speak, the girl let out a sudden, piercing scream. Her face contorted in absolute agony, and she doubled over, clutching her massive stomach. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the wet grass beside Chloe's grave. Panic exploded in Ethan's chest. The shock vanished, replaced by pure, terrifying adrenaline. He sprinted forward, dropping to his knees beside her in the mud. She was gasping for air, her face pale and covered in a cold sweat. "Help me," she whimpered, her fingers digging into his expensive wool coat. Ethan didn't hesitate. He scooped her up into his arms, ignoring the strain in his back. She was frighteningly light despite the pregnancy. He carried her away from the graves, sprinting down the gravel path toward the main gate where his SUV was parked. He roared at his driver to open the doors. He laid her gently in the back seat, shouting the address of the most exclusive, state-of-the-art private hospital in Manhattan. The tires squealed as the heavy vehicle tore through the quiet morning streets. The black SUV aggressively jumped the curb outside the emergency entrance of the elite Manhattan Medical Center. Ethan kicked the door open before the vehicle even fully stopped. Medical staff rushed out with a gurney, responding immediately to the arrival of one of their wealthiest donors. They transferred the agonizing girl onto the pristine white sheets and sprinted down the brightly lit corridors. A senior doctor, recognizing Ethan, tried to intervene, suggesting that homeless patients were usually transferred to city clinics. Ethan grabbed the doctor by the collar of his scrubs, his blue eyes blazing with a terrifying, homicidal fury. He snarled, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. demanding that the girl be placed in the VIP maternity suite and receive the absolute best care the hospital could provide, regardless of the cost. The doctor paled, nodded frantically, and barked orders at his staff. The heavy double doors of the maternity ward swung shut, leaving Ethan alone in the vast, silent waiting room. He collapsed into a leather chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. His mind was a chaotic storm. If this girl was Chloe's daughter, that meant Chloe had survived the escape. It meant Richard's cruelty ran far deeper than he ever imagined. But most importantly, it meant the child. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking so badly he could barely unlock the screen. He dialed David, his head of security, a former NYPD detective with a dark past and ruthless efficiency. When David answered, Ethan gave him a single, impossible order. Find everything that happened to my wife 20 years ago. Dig up the graves if you have to. Do not fail me. 2 agonizing hours passed. The hospital waiting room felt like an interrogation chamber. Finally, the heavy doors opened, and the senior doctor approached Ethan, his expression grim but relieved. He explained that the girl was severely malnourished and exhausted, but the baby's heartbeat was stable for now. They had administered sedatives to stop the premature contractions. She would sleep until the next morning. The doctor handed Ethan a small, clear plastic bag containing her personal belongings, stripped away before she was put in a hospital gown. Ethan's hand shook as he opened the bag. Inside was a cheap cracked smartphone, a few crumpled dollar bills, and a battered New York State ID card. Ethan pulled out the plastic card, his breath catching in his throat. The name read Lily Evans, but it was the date of birth that stopped his heart entirely. He stared at the numbers, doing the math in his head over and over again, praying for a different result. She was born exactly 7 months after Chloe had abandoned him. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The sudden escape, the cold, rehearsed phone call, the brutal rejection in the hospital room. Chloe hadn't left him because she wanted Richard's money. She had left him because she was pregnant. She knew Richard was a monster, and she knew he would never let another man's child live. She had sacrificed her own freedom, her own happiness, and ultimately her own life to protect their baby. Lily was his daughter. Ethan fell to his knees in the sterile hallway, 20 years of suppressed grief and newly discovered love tearing violently from his throat in a ragged, agonizing sob. The sun was rising over Manhattan, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and bruised purple. Ethan had not slept. He sat beside Lily's hospital bed in the luxurious VIP suite, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. She looked so fragile, a broken bird tangled in a web of IV lines and heart monitors. He realized with a sudden wave of panic that she had absolutely nothing. No clothes, no baby supplies, no family to rely on. He quickly pulled out his phone and dialed Jessica, his brilliant and relentlessly efficient secretary. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and alert despite the early hour. Ethan's voice cracked as he explained the situation. He didn't tell her everything, just that he had found a pregnant relative in desperate need, and he needed a massive favor. He asked Jessica to meet him at a luxury department store on 5th Avenue the moment it opened. 30 minutes later, Ethan stood in the blindingly bright aisles of the maternity ward. Jessica arrived, impeccable as always, taking one look at his bloodshot eyes and ruined suit before quietly taking charge. Ethan was completely out of his depth. He stared blankly at rows of tiny, absurdly expensive baby clothes. Jessica moved with military precision, selecting soft fabrics, neutral colours, and essential supplies. When they moved to the women's clothing section, Ethan paused. He picked out a soft, emerald green cashmere sweater. It was the exact colour of Chloe's eyes. Jessica watched him quietly, her sharp intuition piecing together the broken fragments of the story he wasn't telling her. She gently placed a hand on his arm, offering silent, steadfast support in the midst of his breaking world. Ethan returned to the hospital loaded with designer bags, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The nurse informed him that Lily was finally awake. He pushed open the heavy wooden door of the suite. Lily was sitting up, clutching the white hospital blankets tightly to her chest, her green eyes darting around the luxurious room in sheer panic. When she saw Ethan, she shrank back against the pillows. Ethan placed the bags gently on the sofa and approached the bed slowly, holding his hands up in surrender. He spoke softly, introducing himself properly, assuring her that the hospital bills were entirely covered. Lily stared at him suspiciously, demanding to know why a billionaire was helping a street kid. Ethan took a deep breath, the truth burning like acid in his throat. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out her battered ID card. Then he pulled out his own worn leather wallet, extracting a faded, creased photograph. It was a picture of him and Chloe, taken in a cheap photo booth in Brooklyn 20 years ago. He handed the photo to Lily. Her hands trembled as she took it. She stared at the smiling face of the mother she never knew, then looked up at Ethan, the realization slowly dawning in her widened eyes. Ethan's voice broke as he spoke the words that would change their lives forever. "She didn't abandon you, Lily. She was trying to save you, and I am so incredibly sorry that it took me 20 years to find you. I'm your father." The room descended into a heavy, profound silence, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor and the quiet, desperate sound of Lily beginning to weep. The tears washed away the tough exterior Lily had built to survive the unforgiving streets of New York. Over the next hour, she poured out the tragic story of her life. She explained that Richard had never known she existed. Chloe, terrified for the baby's life, had orchestrated a desperate, secret birth with the help of a loyal, elderly housekeeper at the Hamptons estate. The night before Chloe died in the crash, she had smuggled the infant Lily out of the mansion, placing her in the arms of the housekeeper with a bag of cash and instructions to hide. The plan was for Chloe to disappear and return for her later. But Chloe never came back. The housekeeper raised Lily in secret for 5 years, until sickness claimed her life. Lily was thrown into the merciless meat grinder of the state foster care system. She bounced from group homes to abusive families, running away at 16 to survive on the streets. She had only learned about her mother's identity a year ago, finding a hidden letter the housekeeper had left behind in an old safety deposit box. She had come to the cemetery searching for ghosts, never expecting to find a father. Ethan sat frozen, his blood running cold as he listened to the horrors his daughter had endured while he was building skyscrapers. He asked gently about the baby she was carrying. Lily looked down, her face flushing with shame. She explained that the father was a good kid named Marcus, a mechanic she met in Queens. But Marcus was currently rotting in Rikers Island prison, wrongfully accused of assault after violently defending Lily from 2 rich, drunk kids who tried to attack her in an alleyway. Ethan's jaw clenched, his eyes hardening into blue ice. Ethan stepped out into the hospital corridor, his mind shifting from paralyzing grief to absolute, calculated warfare. He dialed David. The head of security answered immediately. David had spent the last 24 hours tearing through Richard's buried past. What he found confirmed Ethan's darkest nightmares. Richard had known about the baby. He had discovered Chloe's pregnancy tests in the penthouse. Instead of killing her immediately, the sadistic billionaire had blackmailed her. He threatened to have Ethan murdered by his cartel connections if Chloe didn't return, submit to his control, and quietly dispose of the child. Chloe had played the ultimate game of deception, pretending to obey, faking a miscarriage, and hiding the pregnancy under loose clothes until she could smuggle Lily out. Richard discovered the deception the night she died. He had ordered his security team to run her off the mountain road. Ethan gripped his phone so tightly the glass screen threatened to crack. Richard was dead, having succumbed to cancer 5 years ago, escaping earthly justice. But there were still battles to win. Ethan ordered David to immediately pivot. "I need the best criminal defense lawyers in New York. I want a team mobilized at Rikers Island within the hour. We are getting a boy named Marcus out of hell today." He hung up the phone, the corporate titan fully awakened. He had failed to save Chloe from the monsters of the city, but he would burn Manhattan to the ground before he let the system destroy his daughter and the boy who tried to protect her. The legal machinery of Ethan's empire moved with terrifying, unstoppable speed. His lead attorney, an aggressive shark named Harrison, descended upon the district attorney's office. When confronted with private investigators uncovering security footage of the alleyway attack, footage the police had conveniently ignored to protect the wealthy attackers, the DEA folded immediately. The charges against Marcus were dropped, replaced with massive civil lawsuits against the corrupt officers. While the lawyers worked, Ethan returned to the psychiatric facility upstate. He walked into Sarah's room, not with apologies, but with undeniable purpose. Sarah was curled in a corner, staring blankly. Ethan knelt beside her, pulling out his phone. He showed her a video of Lily sitting in the hospital bed, eating fresh strawberries. He explained everything: the secret baby, the sacrifice, the truth about Chloe's disappearance. Sarah stared at the screen, her trembling fingers tracing the face of her niece. The thick, suffocating fog of her madness seemed to fracture. The guilt that had driven her insane was suddenly replaced by a desperate, burning need to protect the last piece of her best friend. Sarah looked at Ethan, her eyes clearer than they had been in a decade, and whispered, "Get me out of this place. I need to see her." Ethan nodded, making the arrangements instantly. He was gathering the shattered fragments of his past, piecing together a family from the ruins. For the first time in 20 years, Ethan felt the cold, dead spaces in his heart filling with the warm, chaotic light of hope. 3 weeks later, the VIP maternity suite was a scene of beautiful, absolute chaos. Lily's water had broken just before midnight. Ethan paced the hallway like a caged tiger, wearing a crumpled designer suit, flanked by Jessica, who quietly handed him cups of terrible hospital coffee. Sarah was inside the room holding Lily's hand, her erratic energy finally channeled into fierce maternal support. The heavy doors burst open, and a young man, in a cheap, ill-fitting suit, sprinted down the corridor. It was Marcus. He had been released from Rikers just hours prior, driven straight to the hospital by David's security team. He looked terrified, exhausted, and desperately in love. Ethan intercepted him, grabbing the boy by the shoulders. Marcus flinched, expecting a billionaire's judgment, but Ethan pulled him into a sudden, crushing embrace. "Go to her," Ethan commanded, his voice thick with emotion. Marcus rushed into the delivery room just as a sharp, piercing cry echoed through the sterile halls. The sound stopped Ethan's heart. It was the sound of life, the sound of a future he thought was buried in a cold cemetery, upstate. 10 minutes later, the doctor emerged, smiling tiredly, inviting Ethan inside. He walked into the room, the bright lights feeling warm rather than blinding. Lily was exhausted, her face glowing with a triumphant, beautiful sweat. In her arms was a tiny, fragile bundle, wrapped in pink blankets. Marcus was crying quietly beside her. Sarah looked up at Ethan, tears streaming down her face, and offered a genuine, unbroken smile. Ethan approached the bed, his hands trembling, as he looked down at his newborn granddaughter. The baby had bright, piercing green eyes, Chloe's eyes. Ethan reached out, his large, rough finger gently stroking the infant's incredibly soft cheek. The little girl turned her head, instinctively grasping his finger with surprising strength. The heavy, crushing weight of 20 years of grief, anger, and guilt finally broke, washing away in a flood of silent tears. He looked around the room. He saw Marcus, a good kid given a second chance at life. He saw Sarah, her mind anchoring of itself to the reality of this new family. He saw Jessica standing quietly by the door, a woman who had stood by his side through the darkness and into the light. And he looked at Lily, his brave, beautiful daughter, who had survived the worst of the world to bring this miracle into existence. The empire he had built, the millions in the bank, the towering skyscrapers of glass and steel, none of it mattered. This small, crowded hospital room held his entire universe. He leaned down and kissed Lily's forehead, whispering a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. He promised they would never be alone, never be cold, and never be afraid again. The ghosts of the past would always linger in the shadows, but they no longer controlled him. Chloe's sacrifice had not been in vain. Out of the darkness of Richard's cruelty, a new, unbreakable family had been forged in the fire. Ethan smiled, a true, warm smile, holding his granddaughter as the morning sun rose over the New York skyline, bathing the room in brilliant golden light. The long, agonizing nightmare that began with a desperate escape 20 years ago finally ended in a hospital room bathed in morning light. Ethan realized that true wealth wasn't measured by towering skyscrapers or digits in a bank account, but by the resilient, unbreakable bonds of family. He had lost the love of his life to a monster's cruelty, but through a miraculous twist of fate, he had rescued her legacy from the unforgiving streets. If this emotional journey touched your heart, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more cinematic stories, and leave a comment below. Would you have forgiven the past to build a future? Let us know your thoughts.